Hello, everyone, and welcome to CIFAR Talks Memory and the Malleable Mind. My name is Jennifer Moore-Rattray, Gawitha Madanawa, Nuihawaniya, Jennifer Moore-Rattray, and I'm a proud CIFAR Board Director. And I will be your host for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which CIFAR operates in Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I am speaking to you from Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, also the homeland of the Red River Métis. As this is a virtual event from wherever you are joining us, I encourage you to reflect on the history of the land you are situated on and to learn more about the steps we can all take towards truth and reconciliation. Well, before we begin, a few housekeeping items to share. Today's session will be 1 hour. There will be a short Q&A period at the end, so if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address it. Today's talk is also available en français, so select the globe interpretation icon at the bottom and select French to hear simultaneous interpretation. This session is being recorded and will be available on cifar.ca shortly. Well, as you may know, CIFAR is a global research organization proudly based in Canada. CIFAR convenes and mobilizes the world's most brilliant people from across disciplines and at all career stages to advance transformative knowledge and solve humanity's biggest problems together. We are supported by the governments of Canada, Alberta, and Quebec, as well as Canadian and international foundations, individuals, corporations, and partner organizations. Through our 15 research programs and the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, CIFAR convenes close to 400 of the world's top researchers from 141 institutions in 20 countries. This community has included 23 Nobel Prize laureates, 4 Turing Award winners, and more. Our early career programs affect and support some of the most exciting young researchers in the world today. We pursue ideas that drive profound change, from kickstarting the revolution in artificial intelligence that powers the modern world, to catalyzing research that shows how full-day kindergarten maximizes a child's potential. CIFAR continues to have a profound impact on the world. And that brings us to today's topic as we explore the elusive area of memory. At the center of our lives, shaping how we learn, connect, and grow, is memory. And yet one of the great puzzles of neuroscience is why we remember so little from the earliest years of life. The insights uncovered in CIFAR's Child and Brain Development Program and its synergies with programs such as Learning in Machines and Brains help us see how early experiences shape the architecture of the mind. They also carry implications far beyond childhood, influencing how we think about education, technology, health, and even aging. This will be the focus of our conversation today. Moderating our conversation is Sarah Reardon, an award-winning science journalist currently covering biomedical research and policy at Science. Sarah also previously served as a staff reporter at both Nature and New Scientist and hails from a research background with a master's degree in molecular biology from the University of Washington. So thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Jennifer. I'm excited to be here today to moderate the talk on this important and fascinating subject. And I'd like to take a moment to set the stage for this conversation a little more than Jennifer's already adding to what Jennifer's already said. Memory is fundamental to the human experience, but so much of it still remains mysterious. One of its most intriguing puzzles is infantile amnesia, why we remember so little, if anything, from the earliest years of our lives. This is a question that's long fascinated scientists and one that I've had the privilege to explore in my own reporting. In fact, it was the focus of an article I wrote recently for Science magazine, looking at what might be lurking in the recesses of the infant brain and whether those early memories are truly lost or just hidden from view. And today's conversation is going to take us even a step further. As we explore how early experiences shape memory, we'll also consider what this means for brain health across the lifespan, from childhood all the way through old age. So without further ado, let's dive into our discussion. I'm delighted to introduce our incredible speakers. Alison Gopnik is a dual appointee at CIFAR, both as a fellow in our Learning in Machines and Brains program and as an advisor to our Child and Brain Development program. She's a professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a member of the Berkeley AI Research Group. She's a pioneering cognitive scientist whose work spans everything from how children learned to how evolutionary biology and artificial intelligence can deepen our understanding of cognition. Sarah Power was part of the Next Generation Trainee Program with CIFAR's Child and Brain Development Program and is a postdoctoral fellow at the Max-Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Her research focuses on memory development in toddlers, the phenomenon of infantile amnesia, and the development of memory engrams across species. Currently, she investigates memory development in toddlers, building on her previous work with rodent models during her PhD at Trinity College Dublin. Her interdisciplinary approach bridges animal and human research to provide new insights into the fundamental nature of memory engram development. And Tomás Ryan is CIFAR-Azrieli Global Scholar 2020 to 2022 in the Child and Brain Development Program and a professor of neuroscience at the Trinity Institute of Neurosciences at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. His research group aims to understand how memory engrams change over development and how they interact with innate representations. His research program aims to understand how memories and instincts can interact to enable adaptive behavior. Thank you all for joining us. And so before we dive into the science, I'd love to ask each of you, why should people care about memory formation in childhood? What makes this such a critical and often overlooked topic when we think about human development, education, and even public health? Sarah Power, maybe you would like to start us off.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I think unlike milestones like walking or talking, memory development really happens quietly and under the surface, and it's not as noticeable, but it's also extremely important. And these early memory processes really shape how children begin to understand the world. And I think by studying memory development, it gives us a vital lens on to look at things like educational policy, all the way to the early detection of developmental disorders. And I think the way that we understand how memory takes shape in these earliest years is, and then the better we can use this to support healthy brain development, equitable learning, and also just long-term cognitive help.
Thanks for that. Tomás, would you like to add to that?
I think when we think about why we're interested in memory as a society, we're often focused on practical applications, and therefore we immediately think about disease, and then we associate problems of memory with aging. But even when we take that sort of practical standpoint, the greatest opportunity for positive intervention or positive enrichment in an individual's memory is during learning, it's during development. And so I think that's something that we have been overlooking in many respects as a scientific community, but also from a fundamental scientific perspective, when wanting to understand about the brain, seeing how organisms that are there primarily to learn, primarily to develop before they need to express their own agency in order to survive and reproduce, is really the ideal time to study learning. And so from my perspective, it seems that it's just Memory 101 is about understanding infant memory, even though for various historical reasons, that isn't always how we look at things in the neuroscience and psychology of memory.
Thanks. And Alison, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'd echo something that Tomás said. I think it's very easy to think about memory, as with most cognitive capacities, as if it's just a sort of one-dimensional thing that gets better as we get older from childhood and then falls off again when we age. And that's a common sort of picture of development. But when we look at children and we look at infants, what we realize is that there's actually many different kinds of memory, many different functions that memory serves, and that there are trade-offs between those different kinds of memory. And children in childhood seem to have memory capacities that are very well suited, as Tomás said, to that particular capacity they have for an incredible amount of learning and extracting a lot of information from the world. And in some ways, that means that their memory is quite different from the kind of memory that we think of in adulthood. And I think there's some evidence that it switches again in older life. So instead of thinking of it as just, okay, there's this one thing, we get more of it as we get older, we lose some of it as we age, we should think about different kinds of memory, different memory systems, different kinds of neural instantiations that serve different kinds of functions. And thinking about childhood makes that particularly vivid. And it may be, to anticipate a little, that part of the reason why we don't have access to those earliest memories is because they're really quite different. They have a different character. They're serving different functions than the memory that we have as adults.
Yeah, so I was struck by something you said there, that this type of memory might be very well suited for for early childhood development. Does that suggest that there's some sort of evolutionary purpose to infantile amnesia?
Well, I think it's not so much that there's a purpose to infantile amnesia, but there is an evolutionary purpose to having an early infant capacity that's quite different from the kinds of things that we use memory for as adults. So again, to anticipate a little, I think there's lots of evidence, including some really beautiful recent evidence that came out of Nicholas Turk-Brown's work at CIFAR, that shows that even very young babies, very much against the conventional wisdom, do actually have memories of specific events, what psychologists call episodic memories. They can remember specific things. They can use those memories to perform new actions. We've known for a long time, for instance, that 1-year-olds can do what's called deferred imitation. So if you show them something like someone bangs their head on a box and it lights up, then a week later, bring the 1-year-old in and they'll immediately do the same thing. And that suggests they've remembered something quite specific from just that one incident. And what Nicholas discovered is that their hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that seems to be responsible for this kind of memory, is active from the time that they're a year old in the same way. So that means they're remembering specific things, but somehow they aren't putting them together in the same way that we do as adults. And in particular, adults have what's sometimes called autobiographical memory. We have like a single timeline in our heads. We think that we can reconstruct all the things that happen to us in a particular order over time and think of them as if they were experienced ourselves. And that seems to be the thing that is a later development. And again, you can sort of see if what you want to do is just extract as much information from the world as you possibly can, then organizing that information into a single timeline isn't as important as just knowing that it's there. But if you want to do some of the adult things like anticipate the future or recollect the past or communicate to others what your specific experience was, then just extracting as much information as you can isn't as important as organizing it in this kind of particular timeline.
Sarah Power, you study something similar with how memory systems develop over time. So what is the latest evidence about when memory begins to function, and how are those memories processed differently later in life?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the research that Alison just mentioned is really challenging the way we think about early memory. So for a long time, I think we used to think of this infancy as this blank state because we don't remember early childhood memories. But research is starting to show that memory is functioning in context of maybe episodic-like memory. Now, it might not be the same as how it's functioning in adulthood, but as Alison mentioned, that infants are starting to form memories. And we've seen this as early as with Roe v. Colley's work, where they demonstrated that as early as 2 months old, infants are showing episodic-like learning. And then following with Patricia Bauer's work that Alison mentioned, where infants and toddlers can imitate a set of actions even a week or month later. And this is really showing that infants are capable of maybe forming and retrieving these different memories. But what's really interesting is that there's something different there in the processing, that they're not able to retrieve them at a later time point. And I think what's important to mention is that, of course, the brain structures like the hippocampus, which is important for episodic memory, which is involved in infantile amnesia, is still under construction in these early years and may be involved in this process. But what we're really finding is I feel like there is being a movement towards more a hypothesis of storage or retrieval deficit in terms of infantile amnesia. so that infants can form memories, but there's a deficit there in either storage or retrieval. And then in other words, the memories might still be there, but we just can't consciously recall them.
And Tomás, maybe you'd like to add to that, because your research looks into the physical storage of memory. Would you like to explain kind of what's happening to the brain during infancy that could account for this amnesia we experience?
So many things are happening during development, which is what makes infantile amnesia such a difficult phenomenon to pin down when we're looking for a mechanism that is causing it. So my lab, we study infantile amnesia in mice. Others study it in mice too, and people have been studying infantile amnesia in rats going back at least to the 1970s. And we can parallel, to a certain extent, the development of primates like humans with rodents based on what we know about broad-scale brain anatomy, particularly focusing on the hippocampus, as we just heard, is important for episodic and contextual memory, but also looking at hormonal changes, when does adolescence occur, and so on. And we tend to think of rodent infancy as happening at around 2.5 to 3.5 weeks of age. So a rodent in the lab might live for a year or two, if allowed to. And so they're born as pups, and they're dependent on their mothers for at least 3 weeks. And normally at 3 weeks of age is when we separate them from their mothers and allow them to get their own home cage. And when we're studying infantile amnesia in rodents, we're normally training them when they're 15, 16, or 17 days of age. Now, at that point in time, they have a lot of motivation, they can move around, they can do things. And crucially, they can form long-term memories. So we can see them form long-term memories even when they're 15 days of age. And we call it a long-term memory because it survives for at least a day. So if we train a mouse when they're 15 days old, and we test them at 16 days and we see they still have the memory, we can say, okay, an engram has formed. An engram means the biological basis of memory. And then we wait for infantile amnesia to happen, of which there's a very strong consensus across the labs working in different continents, in North America, in Europe, and Australia. We see infantile amnesia between 20 and 24 days of age. So that's when it happens. And by the time you get to 25 days of age, it's as though the rodents have forgotten everything about what you taught them earlier on. But the biology is a very tough question, because in that week, there are so many things going on in the brain. You can pretty much pick your favorite molecule or brain region or physiological process. And it's going to be changing during that time period. So it's very easy to come up with a strong hypothesis as to what's causing infantile amnesia. It's a lot more difficult to identify what's actually doing it.
Yes, a lot of animal work going on here. I wanted to get into humans a bit too. To Alison, you've described childhood as the R&D department of the human species, which is a great way of putting it. How does early memory, or this lack of it that we see with infantile amnesia, support or hinder learning and development?
Well, there's a really interesting feature of early memory, even in preschoolers, that there's more and more evidence for, which is that in adults, what happens with memory, as with attention, is that we remember the things that we focus on. So we remember the things that we pay attention to, and we just edit out all the other kinds of things that are there in the background. Now, that's different for children. And anyone who's played a game like concentration with a preschooler, a card game where you have to remember things incidentally, will have seen that the children, in some ways, even though they're bad at remembering things that you have to focus on, are remarkably good at remembering what's going on in the background. And there's some recent studies that show this systematically. So if you show children and adults a series of cards that have two pictures on top of each other, say one's red and one's green, and you say, okay, now tell me whether the red ones are hearts, the adults will remember that they saw the red ones. But then if you ask them afterwards, now tell me about the green ones, were any of the green ones hearts, they won't remember them because they weren't paying attention to them. They didn't seem to encode that. But the children seem to have a broader kind of, what I've sometimes called a kind of lantern of consciousness. They seem to be taking in more information than the adults. And there's some really lovely work from Amy Finn at actually at Toronto, a Canadian researcher, which shows that that seems to be even true from the perspective of their brains. So if you look at you give a task to an adult and a child, and then you look to see if their brains are encoding what their brains are encoding, the children are literally encoding more of the information. They seem to, in some ways, remember more of these, especially these sort of incidental, unattended things. And again, if you're thinking about the amazing amount of learning that they're doing, that means that that seems to be really important. It's good to just remember things, even if you're not paying attention to them, even if they're going on in the background for learning purposes. But you can also see why that would give you a really different kind of memory, a different picture of the world than the one that you get when you're older. And it might be very hard to make those two speak to each other. It might be hard if you've had that kind of memory to then and you now have this adult, much more focused autobiographical memory, to have those two things go together. And the other thing is that we know that there's a lot of conceptual change going on in the preschool period. The whole way that children are thinking about the world is really different when they're 4, say, than when they're 3. And that also means that it's harder for the memories to talk to one another. So in work that we did actually at Toronto a while ago, we showed that, for instance, if you give children theory of mind, a false belief task, where they have to remember what they thought as opposed to remembering what happened, the children have a lot of difficulty with that. They can tell you what just happened, but it's harder for them to say, what did you see? What did you experience? What did you think? What was your inner life like? And again, that makes it so different from that makes it really different from adult memory.
So I imagine this different learning style has a lot of implications for early childhood education. You mentioned like preschool age kids. How can understanding how this memory works help us better design educational environments that align with how these kids' brains work? Alison, if you'd like to take that briefly.
Well, I think there's a really interesting tension because, again, a lot of times we talk about, especially with preschoolers, we have a model in our head, which is something like the school age model, where you're supposed to be paying attention to a single thing at a time. You're supposed to put that into memory. Then you have a test where they ask you about the specific thing that you remembered. And that may not be a good model for what's going on. That's a fine model for how you want to teach 7 or 8-year-olds. It's not, I think, a good model for 3 and 4-year-olds. And there's a reason why the sort of play-based, inquiry-based approaches to early childhood education seem to be really effective, because that's what the children are doing when they're just playing and just being in the world when they're 3 or 4, when they're 3 or 4 years old. So the sort of model we have of, did you remember this fact that's on this exam, is not going to be a good model for 3 and 4-year-olds or for preschoolers and toddlers in general.
Sarah, you study toddlers in your lab as well. Do you have anything to add to that about the implications for education?
Yes, I think I just would reiterate what Alison said. It's all about really tailoring it for exactly that point of development in time and how they learn. And it's definitely something that feel I've gained a bit more experience working with toddlers, and how random they can be, right? And how they're connecting and what elements that they take in different tasks, and just kind of taking in all this information and building a proper or the most applicable educational strategy for that age.
And sticking with you for a minute, does this imply that there's some early interventions that might affect how our memory develops later as an adult? And have we seen any links between this early life memory development and later life brain health or cognitive abilities later in life, depending on what we experienced as children at this age?
Yeah, the connections are definitely becoming increasingly more clear. That like early development is really a kind of a key part of how the brain's organizing itself. And strong foundational memory skills in childhood are associated with better outcomes in school, greater emotional resilience, and even healthier cognitive aging. And kind of on the flip side, disruptions in early memory, whether it be to stress or trauma, can actually do the opposite. But the good news is that early interventions work. So through supportive environments, responsive caregiving, and play-based learning cues can strengthen memory systems during this like most plastic kind of formative phase.
Tomás, if there are these implications for later in life, what what can we learn from understanding memory formation for for some neurodevelopment conditions or mental health disorders? Have there been any links shown there, and can our study of early memory inform those?
So I think that it's possible that early memory and infantile amnesia are, broadly speaking, models of other forms of memory and forgetting as we go through life. Now, that's an assumption. We don't know whether infantile amnesia is a discrete thing that is only happening at that time, or whether it has things in common with other forms of forgetting throughout the lifespan. But we do know that it's having a similar effect on memory engrams as other kinds of forgetting is. So in my lab, we spent a lot of time labeling engrams, which basically just means the specific brain cells that are storing a memory. So, you've got billions of brain cells connected by trillions of synapses, and only a subset of them are contributing to memory storage at any given moment. And we call those engram cells. And what we've learned through studying infantile amnesia, but also mouse models of Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, and also just everyday forgetting, which, rodents show everyday forgetting the same way we do when we forget where we left our car keys and so on. When we label engrams in the rodent before forgetting happens, we can go back to those cells after forgetting has happened, and we can use optogenetics to turn those cells on or to inhibit them and see what happens. And when we do this, what we find is that if we stimulate the engram cells, the memory expresses itself again. And we started doing this in adult forms of forgetting, and more recently, us and others have been doing it in infantile amnesia in rodents. And in every case that has been examined, it seems the memory is still in the brain, and the types of forgetting we're looking at are actually just affecting the retrieval of the memory and not the maintenance of the memory information itself. So therefore, what we can learn from this is that forgetting more and more is probably a feature of the brain. And we often think about forgetting as being a bug, as being a problem, because it's exacerbated in dementia and in aging and so on. But once you consider that forgetting is reversible, and one thing we're investigating at the moment is not just can we restore memories invasively, but can we find natural psychological conditions, ethological conditions, whereby a rodent will start to re-express memories that we think they've lost. We start to see that the brain is making some kind of a decision over what memories to use. And I think in the case of early development, this may be what's happening, that we're not just suppressing memories, and we're certainly not erasing them. What we seem to be doing is deciding to use our information in our brains in very different ways. As Alison said, this could be because in humans, we're changing how the autobiographical narrative is evolving. Of course, in rodents, we would have to come up with a slightly broader explanation. But nevertheless, I think the core point is the same, that the brain as a decision-making machine, as a foraging machine, is changing how it's acting agentically with the world, and therefore needs to organize its information differently.
Yeah, there's an interesting piece, which is I mentioned a whole bunch of these studies that show that children are better at incidental memory, even if they're worse at focused memory. And there's some evidence that this is true in healthy aging as well. So this isn't like Alzheimer's, but if you do the same kind of experiment that I just described, where there's something in the background, older people as well seem to be better at getting the information that is in the background, that's the incidental information, versus the information that's focused. And again, it might be this difference about the function of picking out a memory that's relevant to the specific thing that you need to do right away, which is sort of the 35-year-old adult task, versus either the children who are learning or maybe the older people who are passing on information that they've experienced in the past. That seems to be something that both in humans and even in orcas, postmenopausal grandmothers do a lot of, is, sort of, here's something that happened 50 years ago. Now I'm going to tell you young ones about it. And having this different, broader focus of memory might be helpful for that task, as opposed to the just sort of right now, I need to put out this fire kind of tasks that the 35-year-old has to face.
So are you saying that there's some similarities in how memory might be functioning in older people as in toddlers? And would any of the same principles we were talking about before with education and health interventions apply?
I mean, I think again, it's different. The functions are different, but it is interesting that you see this general similarity, and it seems to have something to do with prefrontal areas of control, which we know are developing in childhood, and then we know also fade off more with aging. And again, the traditional way of thinking about this has been, oh, it's just a deficit. But of course, that doesn't make very much sense from an evolutionary point of view. And I think there's some evidence that there's a kind of trade-off between this very tight prefrontal focus and then having this kind of broader picture with more information about the world around you and a capacity to integrate more information, which seems to be true in both cases. And again, if you're thinking about something like, I think there's a lot of evidence now that what you want to do with older people is play to their strengths, find things that are playing to their strengths rather than just thinking about it as, oh, they've got a deficit.
I wanted to go back to something that Tomás was talking about with these invasive measures where you can artificially reactivate memories through optogenetics. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and whether this is something that it's not possible in humans right now, but eventually, if we were able to enhance or manipulate memory with future technologies, this is something that would be exciting, worrying?
Well, optogenetics has revolutionized neuroscience in the past 15 years, and it's given us a remote control for neurons at real psychological time, because light happens to move at the speed of light, which is faster than the speed of synaptic transmission. So by expressing optical receptors, neuroscientists can manipulate circuits. And where engram labeling comes in is when we hijack genes that are expressed as a function of neuronal spiking. And we can tag cells in a particular moment that are active, and then we test whether they're engrams by showing that they can activate a memory and they're necessary for a memory. This method is too invasive for use in humans. You only use this type of approach in humans if you're dealing with late phase Parkinson's or severe depression, anything you would use deep brain stimulation for. But that's not the only problem. The issue is we're there at the time of training. So we know where that memory is, and we're only looking for that memory, right? We're looking to prove in principle that we can retrieve that memory. It's not that we can say now make every memory available using this kind of methodology. However, I do think that the insights that rodent studies are producing will lead to a better understanding of memory retrieval in cases of not just infantile amnesia, but disease. And I think this is where Sarah Power's experiments in Berlin are going to be so important, because they will hopefully give us not just a characterization of infantile amnesia to a very detailed level, but also hopefully biomarkers of what's happening to contribute to infantile amnesia.
Yeah, Sarah, would you like to tell us a little bit about where your work intersects with that?
Yeah, so we have developed a behavioral testing paradigm that's actually based off of a rodent task called the Barnes maze, where they navigate their environment to find an escape hole. Of course, we've made it a lot more toddler friendly, where they find their fun friend in one of 4 boxes. And we're looking at studying object context location associations. So we have 2 different environments, underwater and in the jungle. And relative to the environment, the toy is hiding in a different spot. So if we're underwater, the toy is hiding in this box. If they're in the jungle, the toy is hiding in the other box. And we're using this task setup to characterize infantile amnesia and look at different aspects. So we are studying 360 children across different delay points. So we have 3 age ranges between 18 to 24 months, and we have encoding session and 2 retrieval sessions. And we are looking at a later retrieval after a delay of either 1, 3, or 6 months. And what we're interested in looking is to see if, one, does the age of encoding impact memory retrieval, or does it depend on the delay? Is the delay more important? And then also we're really interested in looking at inter-individual differences in the phenomenon of infantile amnesia, because I think a lot of the time it's kind of thought of as this homogeneous phenomenon, and a lot of research has been on personal recollections. So we're trying to move towards more kind of, I guess, non-verbal tasks, real world experiences. And one thing that we have adapted to our task is that everything in the lab is completely unique to the environment. So the toy, the context, the stimuli, nothing exists outside the lab, because we really want to make sure that we are preventing any outside interference. So we know that if they remember where the toy is hiding, or they remember the toy, we know it's only because they've seen it in our test, in our setup.
And are you seeing any individual differences between the kids? Do there seem to be factors that modify how well they're able to perform these tasks?
So I'm reluctant to speak too much about results until the whole sample is completely the whole sample has been completed. But we definitely seeing individual differences, and I can also say that I have been very pleasantly surprised their retrieval ability, so how long they can retain these memories for, or the fact that they can even retain a context object association.
Just thinking about kind of how humans learn, especially at this point in development, kind of brings to mind some machine learning and AI applications. Are we seeing like AIs that learn like children, or attempts to build something like that? Alison, I think that you worked on this a bit.
Yeah. Well, some of what's going on that we've been describing, that Tomás was talking about as well, is what in AI is sometimes called the explore-exploit trade-off. So the trade-off is you could have one thing that you can do if you have lots of information is just try and get as much information as you can, explore it as much as you can. But another thing you can do is actually use that information to solve a particular task. And one of the things that's come out in AI is that there's an intrinsic trade-off between those two things. So you can't both have as much information as you possibly can and look through all of your past experiences and make a quick decision about how you should use that information now. And one of the things that's interesting about child development is it looks as if this early period is one where just getting the information, exploring, and including exploring by doing pretend play, for example, by there's a lovely set of experiments about crib speech where, you just listen to babies in the crib kind of toddlers in the crib talking through what happened to them during the day, as opposed to what you have to do when you have a specific task where you don't really want to be remembering everything that happened over the last 6 months. You don't want to be saying, oh yeah, I remember I was at the zoo, when there's a specific task. And that problem is a very deep problem in AI, and human evolution seems to solve it by giving us these different developmental periods when we're either really oriented towards exploring in childhood and early childhood, or we're really oriented towards exploiting, say, in typical adulthood. And people are starting to think about that in the context of AI systems as well. So having an AI system that sort of starts out being more childlike, and in fact, this is often the kind of just pragmatically the solution that people come up with is, let's start out with this more exploratory system that can consider lots of options and then narrow into the more exploit system that is just going to use a few options. And again, that would make sense out of this kind of thing that Tomás is describing, where the information is there, but it's actually a disadvantage if you were trying to go through every single memory that you've ever had when you were trying to solve a particular task. So forgetting has a lot of function from the exploit perspective.
So it sounds like you're saying first we just collect everything we can, but the ability to sort of understand and process what's important, assign importance to it, might develop a little bit later.
Yeah.
Tomás, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I completely agree with that perspective, and I think explore-exploit trade-offs is going to, that kind of dichotomy is going to explain a lot of what's happening. But I would also add that if you consider what AI has to learn from this, it's a known that real AI is going to have to be partly inspired by the brain. And we need to learn much more about how the brain is doing things. the kind of AI we have with LLMs doesn't place a lot of weight on priors, on instincts that are built into us at a species level, and also on the early kind of childlike learning. But they also don't really take the facts of neuroscience on board yet. And part of the reason for that is we don't know enough about the biology of memory, and we don't know enough about remembering. I would argue that we know more about forgetting right now than we do about what's happening when we remember something. And in the case of forgetting across infantile amnesia, it's possible that what we're seeing is really differential remembering. And forgetting may be a sort of a colloquial label that we give to situations where my mice or your child or your student or your employee or your spouse doesn't remember the thing you want them to remember in a particular instance. Or we've trained them to think that they should have, and they will even say, I forgot, I should have remembered that. But I think we're the only animal that worries about forgetting, that explicitly worries about forgetting. Every animal shows forgetting, but they don't worry about it. They just go around using what memories they think are most adaptive. And when a child forgets something, or when I forget something, usually you're not going into a stupor. It's not that your brain is shutting down. You're thinking about something else. And what I think increasingly is happening is that other memories are competing for expression. So even though my colleagues and friends, and even my own ego might think I should remember this, my brain is smarter than that. My brain is smarter than my consciousness, and it's deciding to express other things and to think about other things. And I think the problem is we've designed so much of society, particularly our education system, around mismatches that are not biologically reasonable. They don't fit our past evolution, and I think they certainly don't fit our current situation or future situation. So there's a lot to learn there about how the brain reaches for information. And once we understand more about those algorithms, I think they can be implemented in artificial intelligence, whether it's biologically inspired or even just with LLMs.
I'm curious up to this point how much collaboration there has been between neuroscientists like yourselves who are coming at this from a biological level and AI researchers, coders who are trying to develop these artificial systems. Has there been much collaboration, crosstalk?
Well, one of the CIFAR programs that I'm involved in is the Learning in Machines and Brains program. And that's very explicitly designed to be a program that puts together cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI. And it's interesting. It's as was mentioned, as Jennifer mentioned at the beginning, the basic ideas of AI were actually discovered at one of these at that CIFAR program. And I think it's really striking that the people who found these basic kind of neural network deep learning mechanisms now really want to talk to people who are actually doing things in neuroscience, people who are actually doing things in cognitive science, because I think they realize, even if the tech guys in Silicon Valley don't, that the current systems are very limited, that we don't have something like artificial general intelligence, that they're not systems that are intelligent the same way that a human brain or a child is. And I think the people who are most sophisticated about AI realize that, and realize that if they want to make further progress, they need to talk to people in neuroscience and cognitive science. And I should say, CIFAR has been a fantastic place in which that process is actually happening. That Learning in Machines and Brains program has been very, very productive about having those kind of interdisciplinary, those interdisciplinary contacts, as indeed has the Child and Brain Development program, which is also one where, people like Tomás can be doing things with mice, someone else can be doing things with how natural early childhood intervention affects later life. Someone like Sarah can be doing experiments with toddlers, and that CBD program is bringing together what might look like quite different kinds of disciplines in very productive ways.
Yeah, there's so many angles we can come at this from. It seems like there needs to be a lot of collaboration and talk between different fields. I wanted to move on to questions now. We're getting quite a few coming in here. And just bring one more field in, the field of sort of psychology or psychiatry. Someone asked, what's the influence of emotion on memory? Sarah Power, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So Seems that emotional valence can have a lot of sway on memory. So, like more memories enriched with emotional valence seem to be retained longer in the case of childhood. And I think this is also important when you bring back to um, educational strategies, making sure that, you know, everything, all of the learning is emotionally positive and everything around that for future learning.
And some really smart questions too. So someone asked to Alison, is it possible that ADHD is a continued expression of all of this noticing that's happening in early childhood? Because some of the ways that that's expressed is this intense awareness of the environment and short-term memory challenges. Do we see any parallels there?
Well, I think this is something that Sarah's research will address. I think the general view of things like ADHD now is that rather than thinking of it as it's a disease, it's a syndrome, there's something you can identify in the brain that's wrong, the right way to think of it is that there's a continuum among people about how much they have this kind of focused attentional and memory strategy and how much they have this kind of broader attention. And as I said, there's a kind of intrinsic explore-exploit trade-off between those two things. And part of what's happened is that as our social environment changes, the stress on one of those capacities rather than the other really shifts. So there's been arguments that if you're a hunter, for instance, then having this really, really broad focus of attention is a really good thing to do. But if you're in a classroom, for instance, it's really disruptive and difficult and makes it harder for you to function. So I think the general view now is that the way to think about ADHD is it's this kind of interaction between the way these inter-individual differences in memory and attention and the way that the environment is structured to deal with those differences. And, you know, it's a very heterogeneous, as often with these things, there's many, many different kinds of things going on. But I think that's again, a kind of trade-off way of thinking about it is a better way of thinking about it than just a kind of disease deficit way of thinking about it.
Question maybe for Tomás can take this one. Is there a trap in using terms like amnesia or episodic memory when we're talking about infants? These processes are optimized for their experiences during development. Should we be using different descriptors?
I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, and so I anchor my language firmly in behavior. And because we work on rodents and because we can't speak with them, I can't say anything about their autobiographical consciousness. And working on episodic memories in animals in general is a controversial topic. Some people would say when we have a what, when, and a where component, as we do see in corvids, in non-human primates, and in certain tasks, kind of in rodents, we would say they have episodic memory. And other people might have a different standard and say simply because the hippocampus is active during a given task, then maybe it's an episodic memory. I don't try to think about this too much when I'm studying infantile amnesia because it's very clear that rodents show very strong infantile amnesia for contextual memories, for memories of objects and images, for associations, whether they're object-context associations or Pavlovian fear associations, and for other things like maze learning. So infantile amnesia is quite ubiquitous and definitely involves hippocampal systems in the rodent. So we can be very conservative in how we're thinking about this. We can think about behavior, we can think about engrams, and we can think about development and be entirely objective as we go through that. If we want to ask a specific question about episodic memory or about autobiographical perception of a memory, then of course we need to be working with humans, but also we need to have behavioral constructs and ways of measuring memory that speaks to those particular aspects.
Yeah, this sort of difference between rodents and humans in our choice of model kind of brings me to one of the other questions that we got here. Whether there are any linkages between language acquisition and memory. Who can speak to that?
Well, one of my favorite studies, Sarah mentioned some of these studies with toddlers, is one where they took toddlers to the zoo, and then the toddlers just kind of, experienced the kinds of things that they had in the zoo, and they recorded what happened. And then they took the toddlers back, and sure enough, 2-year-olds will tell you all about their visit to the zoo. But what they discovered was that everything the toddler said, even though the toddler said it as if it was their autobiographical experience, was something that their moms had said at the zoo. So the mom would say, oh, look, that elephant is, trumpeting. And then the children would say, we went to the zoo and we saw an elephant trumpeting. So the idea that your memories are just yours, right? That doesn't quite seem to be true. So it seems as if a lot of the shaping of memory, at least in children in preschool, is coming from communication and language and the things that other people around you are saying. Those of you, I have a very close sibling who's only a year apart. And I think people have had the experience where the siblings will sort of squabble about, no, wait a minute, that didn't happen to you, that happened to me. That's my memory. And presumably part of it is because they're talking and language is really shaping at least the autobiographical part of memory, although obviously there's going to be elements that are there even in mice who aren't there. And I would echo what Tomás was saying, and a really interesting aspect of memory is its role in consciousness, the fact that we can mentally time travel is the way it's sometimes described. Think about the future, think about the past. And a lot of the content of our conscious experience is going through reliving, re-experiencing our memories in this very, very specific way. And that seems to be something that's developing later in the preschool kind of period. And we don't know very much about exactly what makes that happen and how that works.
Just my own question going off of that is this sort of similar to theory of mind and this idea that toddlers don't necessarily see themselves as distinct individuals for some time?
Well, actually, it's interesting. The toddlers see themselves as distinct individuals, but they don't. A lot of this early work about memory came in the context of doing theory of mind, because one of the questions is, okay, so toddlers don't understand that someone else could believe something different than they do. But it turns out that in work that we did, they don't understand that they could have thought something different in the past than they think now. So they don't seem to recognize that their own perception and consciousness could be really different now than the way it was, even in the immediate past, even like the day before. And that, again, might be part of the reason why, even if the memories are there, if they look like they're kind of contradicting what you think now, the toddlers aren't retrieving them.
I had another question about generational brain development changes, that in the past kids may have been playing outside more or had different kinds of experiences when they're very young, whereas now they might have devices, have very structured learning environments. Are there any potential long-term impacts of the shift in early childhood experiences on the way that memory would form or even later in life?
Well, we know that infantile amnesia is being maintained across much of the animal kingdom. So it's been pretty robust for 600 million years, at least in allotricial animals. There's some evidence that precocial animals like guinea pigs don't have infantile amnesia because their infancy is quite different and more autonomous. But in the case of humans, some people have studied infantile amnesia or early childhood memory across culture. And for example, in the Maori culture in New Zealand, there are different reports of how far back early autobiographical childhood memories can happen. And so I think that as we start to look for diversity in the human population, because we've got a huge human population in different cultural situations, but also with a diversity of brain development trajectories, and indeed very complicated modern social environment. I think there's every reason to think that we'll see very different kind of phenotypes with respect to infantile amnesia that will then have to reverse engineer and hopefully model in rodents.
That's
Maybe I can also add in the study that we're running as well, we're also accounting for the fact of whether kids go to kindergarten or not, because we want to have a look deeper into the fact that what if kids are going to kindergarten, they're exposed to these new environments continuously. Does this also change their memory retention or memory development at this period? And does this help them to retain these memories longer, or is it irrelevant?
It sounds like there's a lot of real world applications for this research. Kind of leads us into one more question that we had, which is how long this sort of play-based learning model that Alison was talking about might be effective. Like, could play-based learning still be a good model for all ages and even into adulthood?
Well, I think, again, if you think about this explore-exploit trade-off, even in adulthood, there are times when having this kind of broader focus actually, kicks you out of your regular patterns. And if you think about an example I like is when you travel to a new place, right? Your memories of that new place seem to be much more vivid and rich than what happens to you when you're just doing the same thing over and over again. But it seems to be hard for adults to kind of do both things at the same time. So we actually do things like travel to a new place or go on a retreat or go on a sabbatical to try to kind of kick our minds out of their specific attentional ruts and get a kind of consciousness that's more like the childhood consciousness. And I think if one of my favorite techniques is just think about hanging out with little kids and you realize, wait a minute, things are much, much richer. This, block is full of dogs and airplanes and all sorts of things that I didn't even notice, let alone remember. And the kids are often remembering things that you didn't remember because you weren't paying attention to them. So I think adults can kind of shift back and forth from these two modes. But of course, we wouldn't, we do have to do all these practical things. And as Tomás said, we do need to forget. We couldn't function very well if we were flooded with everything that had ever happened to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, one more question, just real quickly, because we're getting to the end of our time here. And someone wants to know, how do we bridge the gap between industry and academics, and how do we move some of these things that we're learning from experiments into our real world scenarios? Do you have any advice on ways to go about this? Sarah, do you have any ideas on that?
Between industry and
or like educational systems, maybe. How do we sort of get out of this ivory tower of academic research and get some of these things out into the real world?
Yeah, I have to say that I think CIFAR has been really supportive and has guided me to start thinking more about that. Because I think as researchers, we can really get stuck in our own field, and we lose this kind of why. And while it's important that we understand these things, it's also really important that we use those understanding to shape a better future. So I think, yeah, different things that we will learn from studying memory development will impact educational process. So one thing I'm kind of thinking about right now is that in our study, we have two contexts, and the children seem to be able to remember one a lot more than the other. And I mean, of course, preliminary results, but that could be a case that these are things that we can adapt in our educational system. So is there certain salience that really promotes memory in educational settings? And I think, yeah, just thinking about it, more open conversations with people in education, in policy, is really what would bring it forward.
Alison, did you have anything to add to that real briefly?
Well, it's worth pointing out when we're thinking about technology that, of course, our current educational system is a kind of technology, and there's many aspects of it, the fact that you're looking at a blackboard, the fact that you're sitting in a chair, that shape the way that you have attention and cognition and memory. And we could think about how that's related to the kind of underlying neuroscience. It's not like that. It's not like that education system just kind of was always there. It's just part of human life. It's a pretty recent creation. And we can think about how it fits with these broader, more foundational things that we know about human cognition works.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to toss this back over to Jennifer. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. On behalf of CIFAR, I'd like to extend our deepest thanks to our moderator, Sarah Reardon, for guiding us so skillfully through the science and the wonder of memory. To our incredible panelists, Alison Gopnik, Sarah Power, and Tomás Ryan, thank you for sharing your insights, your research, and your passion for understanding how our minds take shape from the very beginning of life. Today's conversation reminds us that memory isn't just about what we recall, it's about how we learn, adapt, and connect with others. From the mysteries of infantile amnesia to the promise of lifelong brain health, this is a field with enormous potential for impact that CIFAR continues to explore. Well, I encourage you all to visit our website, cifar.ca, to learn more about the amazing research happening at CIFAR and ways that you can join the CIFAR donor community and support this work. You can stay up to date by subscribing to our newsletters. You will also be able to access the recording of today's session on our website very soon. Ego sani, chimigwech, merci, and thank you again.